Hello and welcome to the second episode of Within the Plotcast and back to our book Going Postal. Today I will tell you why Vetenari is actually inferior to our main character Moist von Lipwig and what the board game Thought is all about. Today we continue exactly where we left off last time. If you didn't see the first part, go back and have a look at it, otherwise you will not get it. If you only turned into this video, it's your own fault. We are now dealing with super complicated topics and at the end you have to write an essay. So with now everyone gone who doesn't understand sarcasm, let's start with the brief review. Last time Moist von Lipwig was condemned by the patrician to become postminister, and thus unconsciously to become a cog in the patrician's game. Now he gets set free and does the first thing a good impostor would do. He runs off. Think about it, the man gets a job without even having to apply. According to the film, he also gets a free room, hat, and apparently new clothes, and the man thinks, nope, up and away! In our next scene, Lipwig buys an old nag in the occasional box from Hobson's rental stable and rides into the next village. Those who paid attention to the last episode may now remember the name Hobson, which is exactly the name from the last episode when I told you about Hobson's choice. Pratchett would surely not give his protagonist the best horse, he gets what is there, the ranciest horse in the stable. However, that doesn't bother Lipwig at all. He knows how to make the best out of a situation and is prepared. With simple methods, which are also wonderfully represented in the film, he turns an old horse into a halfway sellable horse with the help of shoe polish. Somehow you have to stay in business. He also has another trick up his sleeve, in the truest sense of words. Because what the guards didn't discover during his search were the fake diamond rings sewn into his clothing and the one real diamond ring. This boy is also shown in the film, in which he presented an unsuspecting jeweler with a real diamond ring to buy, and while the latter looks away in a joyful anticipation, he swaps the ring for a cheap copper ring with a glass dome. Lipwig must certainly hurry up before the jeweler notices. Something like, "Here you go, thanks for the money, no, I'm not suspicious at all, bye!" This gives Lipwig the money he needs to buy a decent horse and go a few villages further. When he feels safe, he takes a room in an unknown village and looks forward to returning to Ankh-Morpork soon. Because, as he says himself, the largest city in the Discworld is full of depraved people and cheaters, and it's easier to deceive a cheater than an honest man who would run to the city watch immediately. In addition, according to his own statement, he has a charismatic face, but also one that is easy to forget and hard to remember. That awakened the question in me, what actually makes the difference between a face that you can remember and a face like Lipwig's, which in my opinion also has this quality in film. Attractive, but somehow an everyday face. Look at him, cute, isn't he? To get to the bottom of this question, I rummaged through the internet and came across a meta-study by Robert Franklin Jr. and Reginald Adams Jr. A meta-study is a study that is based on the results of several other studies and can thus form a kind of average. Although it's not completely representative, it's often more precise than a single study and fortunately also shorter. Nevertheless, I do not want to read you the 6 pages of abridged version and will also summarize them. The two investigated the question of which feature of a face and facial expression are distinctive enough to recognize them. In their own experiments, they assumed that people who are good at recognizing and assessing the emotional state of a face, such as anger or sadness and the like, could also be better at remembering faces in general, and that the degree of expression can be measured and have an effect on noticeability. About the result, it's easy to say that they have found out that there is a correlation between the level of expression and the assessment of the emotional state. I have to empathize that it's just a correlation, not a causation. Put simply, more expression, better assessment of the emotional state. Who would have thought that? Try to read this expression on my face. Does that look annoyed to you? Or maybe bored? Angry? Disappointed? If you thought that one of these conditions had to apply, I have to disappoint you. You failed. That's my I just got up and haven't had coffee yet face. In addition to the previous mentioned findings, they took the factor of attractiveness, sociability and sympathy and found out that these have no discernible influence on the noticeability of a face. See here? Even if I comb my hair, it doesn't help. Much better with coffee. According to them, there is an overlap between the emotional expression of a face and the noticeability, but it's perceived differently. A more expressive face, in other words, a person who expresses their emotional states more strongly in their face, is more easily noticeable, but only if the person who is looking at that face is also able to interpret this expression. Similar to the general ideals of beauty that have always been changing over the centuries and cultures, the perceptibility of a face also depends on the viewer. So Lipwig's face is one that some of us could remember better and others not. For a test, I will show you a black screen and you imagine Moist of Lipwig while I slowly unblur a picture of him. And do you remember Lipwig? Well, fell for it. It wasn't Lipwig after all. To make sure that nobody remembers him, he uses utensils such as mustaches, clothes, and even changes his manners. But this doesn't help him with his pursuers. They know his face well enough and also know what he's up to. They don't even need to make a facial composition. By the way, anyone who, like me, thought that composite artists will still be used today might be interested in knowing that they don't. After they found out that it's not worthwhile to get a halfway sensible artist every time just to describe a more or less vague face to him, they thought, why not puzzle faces? In 1959, they developed a system called Identikit, which includes drawings of facial features on transparent acetate sheets that could be superimposed on one another to produce the composite image. Later, they tried to aim for realism with a system called PhotoFit by using actual photographs of face parts. Software for the same purpose was introduced in the last 2 decades, since suitable artistic talents is not often available for usual police stations. The FBI is still preferring the composite artist, and I wonder why they don't just use the Sims 4 character creator. There are even costumes included. And who hasn't been attacked by the man in the hot dog costume? Back to the topic and one of the main questions of today's video. In this contest between a fugitive criminal and a head of state with far-reaching means, which of the two is the smarter? Lipwig or Vetenari? One of the obvious points on Lipwig's side is the ominousness of his face. The fact that he has a horse, is several hours away from Ankh-Morpork and has prepared yet another time flimsy. When he was captured, a card was taken from him, which the guards and certainly also the patrician carefully studied. It shows the way to a treasure of 150,000 Ankh-Morpork dollars. A treasure that they will first want to look for and that they never will find because the map is forged. Pratchett has written a character that knows every trick in the book. A character that seems untenable until now. On Vetenari's side, there is a characteristic that has not been discussed in the book so far, but which Discworld fans know from other books. Vetenari knows everything. He has dozens of informers and agents, and no secret within the city, perhaps even across the Discworld, remains hidden from him for a long time. While others will have to search a long way to find Lipwig, Vetenari may have already figured out the route he took. In addition, there is another factor that has not been discussed in the book so far. Vetenari has an enormous knowledge of human nature, a quality that allows him to foresee, at least in part, Lipwig's actions. While others might think that Lipwig will go underground and keep his feet still, Vetenari knows that it won't be long before he tries to trick someone again. Sure, the chase between the two could last for months, but it ends exactly in our next scene. Because Vetenari also has a very specific card up his sleeve, without which, in my opinion, he would have no chance against Lipwig. Lipwig, who sleeps blissfully in his bed, his clothes still on and the window wide open, is woken at 3 o'clock in the night by the door, which flies apart with a crack. Moist is already out the window and awaits a soft landing in the water tub that he had placed underneath, and which has now disappeared. Well, except when the tub is there after all, like in the film, where they just left this important factor out. With intention. That saves them the expensive force-stopping mats for the stuntman. With his sprained leg, he rushes to the stable. He needs a horse of any kind, and after finding his own and settling up, he rides off. If it weren't for the yellow bar between the horse's legs to which it is chained. Someone gave the horse a wheel clamp, or rather, a hoof clamp. In the film, this was replaced by a simple chain, which was at least painted yellow so that the joke remains halfway. A powerful voice comes from the room behind him. "You can't run, and you can't hide, Mr. Lipwick. The Terminator's coming." Okay, the last part was for me, sorry. And for those who haven't noticed, the golem speaks in camel case, in a similar manner as the deaf speaks only in capital letters to empathize with the power of his voice. Lipwick is understandably scared. Some would believe in this situation they would stand and fight, but Terry Pratchett almost always prefers his character to act non-violently. For an author, this is something that is often very difficult to mentally overcome. Is my character someone who is fighting back? You might not want him to look weak. I would like to give this question some space here, in order to include young authors as well to give them help. At the beginning of my authorship, I had the problem that I didn't want my characters to be perceived as weak. I know, the typical problems of a teenager with too much testosterone, but I can say to that, your character is definitely not weak just because he doesn't fight back with force. Depending on the context of the book, a violent character is perceived differently. Imagine a Captain Jack Sparrow who never pulls a saber, or an Han Solo who does not shoot back. Oh, daring topic. Sorry, I take it back. I don't want to be drawn into this discussion. But one should keep in mind that violence is always context dependent. Pirates without fighting are boring, but Jack Sparrow is someone who only acts in self-defense, as is Han Solo. In order to form characters who use violence without the readers perceiving it as negative, it requires a reason. Self-defense, hopelessness and the like are good reasons, because they embody realism. It is difficult for us to imagine a character who belongs to the side of the good and whose first choice is violence. I therefore recommend it to everyone who intends to use violence on their characters, to find a logical reason for this action and to have consequences for the character himself, and for his environment. And for an example,
my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
See, that's enough. Lipwick, as an example, is a very complex character, and on the one hand he would like to flee, but also sees it as an option to buy some time through violence. But he has no intention of killing. Well, except in the movie, where they just throw this important trait overboard and Lipwick tries to stab someone with a pitchfork. In the book, all he does is stir up the pursuer with a bucket. But with a sprained foot, he doesn't get far and he gets grabbed by the uninjured foot. The pursuer introduces himself as his probation officer. He grabs Lipwick and the horse and gets them on his shoulders and marches off towards Ankh-Morpork. In the next scene, Lipwick wakes up in Vetenari's office. Angry about his involuntary transfer, he asks what kind of thing his kidnapper is. Vetenari empathizes that it is an he, and that he's called Mr. Pump, and that he's a golem. An interesting thing for those who know the Discworld, as Going Postal deals very closely with the golem and the concept behind it. Vetenari looks at a being that actually does not live and actually has no will of its own with different eyes. Oh god, I can already see Adora standing in the door with a crossbow. Never mind. Vetenari gives him a personality. He is way ahead of his time. Still, he needs the golem, not directly as a tool, but nonetheless as means to carry out his threat to Lipwick. He knows that nothing can stop this man except an unstoppable being. Otherwise, Lipwick would just flee again, not that he wouldn't try. But the golem doesn't belong to Vetenari. He comes from the Golem Trust, and the owner of this foundation is the only reason why Vetenari is superior to Lipwick. So I'm saying it here very clearly. Vetenari is inferior to Moist, because all his resources, spies, guards, and even nominobs are insufficient to keep this man in place. Only with this unstoppable being does he manage to be superior to him, something that will, however, turn as the book progresses. If you're wondering what you can deduct from it for your own stories, I recommend thinking about what makes this golem unstoppable. I would say it's the fact that he's not human. Doesn't need to sleep and doesn't need to eat. If you want to bind your character to a task, but don't want to deprive him of his superiority or want to threaten him with violence, I can suggest doing this with a plot device that is not human. The threat of this remedy alone can remain in the character's head, whereupon the remedy itself no longer has to be used. The mere possibility of using it is sufficient to bind the character to his task. That's exactly what Vetenari is doing here with the golem. Mr. Pump's description, Mr. Pump does not sleep, Mr. Pump does not eat, and Mr. Pump is not resting, very closely resembles the description of the antagonist of The Mummy from 1999. It will never sleep, it will never eat, and it will never stop. Also a very inhuman character with a similar purpose to drive the main character to his destination, but in a different way. The threat with the strength of Mr. Pump makes Lipwick suspicious. He knows that golems shouldn't harm people, that's on a clay tablet in their heads. Here Pratchett uses the classic myth of the golem, which is borrowed from the Jewish literature and has no free will. The word golem in Hebrew stands for formless mass, but also for embryo. Please never describe your unborn children as a golem. In Ivrit, the name of the modern Hebrew, it also means helpless or stupid. No, Adora, please don't. I take it back. Whew. The first mention of a golem was found in a commentary on the Book of Creation in the 12th century. There you can find a ritual with which one could bring matter to life through certain combinations of letter and numbers. Wait, so the golem doesn't necessarily have to be made out of clay. It could also be made out of minced meat. What many stories have in common, however, is that golems cannot think or act on their own. You have to give them instructions in the form of a document, for example a clay tablet, and place it in their head. In the case of Discworld golems, there are complex rules on these boards that they must follow. This includes the rule mentioned by Lipwick, which Terry Pratchett based on the laws of robotics of Isaac Asimov. First rule, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Second rule, a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. Third rule, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. Lipwick invokes on these rules, whereupon Vetenari asks him if he knows the addition to the first rule. The confused Moise is told, a golem must not harm anyone unless ordered to do so by duly constituted authority. Vetenari justifies this with the fact that the hammer can hardly be allowed to refuse to hit the nail on the head, nor that a saw make moral judgments about the nature of the timber. As you can see from this, it is not absolutely necessary and sometimes even better to not reinvent everything. Pratchett's strength lies in parody, and parody is always based on a close representation of a real thing so that the reader can recognize the source, in this case Asimov's rules. Now he takes these rules and adds something that makes the purpose of the rules absurd and actually no longer valid. A parody does not necessarily have to be pejorative or critical. Terry Pratchett's first book began as a parody of classic fantasy novels with the overdrawing of heroic characters and other classic subjects. Colors of Magic, his first Discworld book, can be seen as a criticism to the same old pattern in fantasy literature, but it's primarily for entertainment. Over time, his world developed into a multi-layered parody of a wide variety of topics, often without giving a direct assessment. Such things evolve naturally. Not by force, but they always build up on a real issue or topics that can be made into a parody. If you're interested in writing a parody, you can derive some ideas from Pratchett's style. I still will try to break these down as an example for you. They have helped me a lot in understanding and writing comedic stuff. Another dialogue is added in the film scene. In contrast to the book, Vetenari explains why he needs the post office very early in the film. The Vetenari in the book is keeping a low profile, something we know from other books. But Vetenari is annoyed. He would like to continue his third game with an opponent from Genua, but the usual method of transmitting message in the city, the clacks, are unreliable. Messages are constantly getting lost and Vetenari doesn't like being dependent on such a company, precisely because he likes to keep control of his city. For everyone who knows the film or the book, think about it. The man hangs a trickster, just to give him a new job, instigates a corporate dispute that leads to various robberies, potential deaths, one romance, half a city fire, and thousands of burned letters. There could be wills in there, important documents, letters about unpaid hospital bills, and all just for a game of thought. Of course, there is more to that, but for now it has to be enough reason for us that he wants to play his third game in peace. Third, by the way, is a game based on the Northern European Nefertafel. How should we know this? Because Pratchett called the game Nuffle, Buffle, Wiffle, Sniffle, Tuffle in Dwarvish. Guess how many attempts I took for this word? Exactly. Too many! In Terry Pratchett's version, there are two factions on a chess-like board, which is still square in the film, but more octagonally in the later version. One player controls the figures of the dwarves, the other controls the trolls. In this early version, both players try to eliminate as many characters as possible from the opponent. The trolls are very few in numbers, but stronger. I won't list the exact rules here as they are a bit complicated and unfortunately I don't have the game in my possession yet, but you can read them on the Discworld wiki website or buy the game yourself. According to the book Thud from 2005, the game received not only precise rules, but also a backstory. The game represents the Coombe Valley Battle, a battle between dwarves and trolls, which is a symbol of the eternal strife between the two factions. However, the game is not an attempt to revive the past, but to settle them, game by game. Because you can only win the battle if you have played and won both sides. You should always be able to put yourself in the mind of the troll and the dwarf. Personally, I don't need a game for this. Because of my height of 1m64 or 5'4", I can put myself in the dwarf's shoes, and with the troll, well. Nefertafel was known from Ireland to Ukraine around the 10th century, but is often ascribed to the Vikings. It consists of a chessboard with 13, 11 or 9 fields in length and width. In contrast to Thud, where the two game parties can take the enemy's pieces off the field, only one side pursues this goal in Nefertafel. The defender has several normal characters and a king whose goal is to get from the center of the playfield to one of the corners. If I remember correctly, the reason for this is that the king wants to move from his throne in the middle to one of his castles in the corners. The nasty mean tax collectors, or rather the attackers, try to prevent this by moving the opposing pieces and to take the king prisoners. Here too there are many different possible moves that I won't explain, but one thing that it has in common with that is you should always play two games and alternate between the positions. If you're looking for an alternative to classic chess, I can recommend both variants to your heart. Fans of the Discworld will probably prefer Thud, and I hope that I will have one of these sets soon. Now that I have talked until I got blue in the face, our trip into Terry Pratchett's world ends for today. Next time we will find out who Yvette Cake actually is and why Stanley is so fascinated by needles. And hey, we are already on page 30 of the book! If things continue like this, I might be able to finish the book in 20 podcasts, so you have a lot to look forward to. So come back next time, leave me a like if you liked the video, and if you want to support me, you can subscribe to my channel. I would be very happy about it. Until next time, see you soon.